What are some of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, in terms of these tax expenditures that can go away and ultimately lead to expanding the base, the broader base of tax?
This is exactly what the Ways and Means Committee is intending on moving through on this summer and putting plans out there. We're literally in the midst of doing our research and our hearings in the Ways and Means Committee to do just that. And we're talking about taking a page out of the playbook of the Fiscal Commission. We have more room to maneuver on tax expenditures than the Fiscal Commission because our revenue targets are a little lower than the Fiscal Commission's revenue targets. And so we have to have a conversation with ourselves and then with Congress and the country about which of these tax shelters should be going away in exchange for lower rates. I would simply say, for those who choose to use class warfare in describing these things, the people and the companies who use tax shelters are those in the top tax brackets. And for every dollar that's parked in a tax shelter, that dollar is taxed at zero. You get rid of the tax shelter in exchange for lower rates for everybody, you're actually taxing that money. And so you're just having a broader base, flatter, simpler system, and more people are actually paying taxes on money that they weren't actually paying taxes on before. We just think it's a smarter way to go. We think it puts us in a better position in the global economy to lead and to create jobs. And I'll just finish what I started with. We got to keep an eye on international competition. And when we tax ourselves a whole lot more than our foreign competitors tax themselves, we're going to cost ourselves competitively. And you can't fix this fiscal problem if you can't grow the economy.
This plan did not talk about Social Security, restructuring Social Security. You've talked about it before, right, but it is not part of this plan. I wonder if you had dealt with Social Security, that perhaps you would not have to have some of the other spending cuts that you're talking about on education, food stamps, cutting services on the people who desperately need those services.
So if we had done a Social Security plan, and I have several bills that I've introduced in the past to do Social Security, I believe in reflecting longevity, a more progressive benefit structure. It still wouldn't have accumulated savings in the 10-year window because, like Medicare, we would have exempted people 55 and above from any changes. The reason we put a Social Security trigger in this bill, saying if Social Security is going insolvent, which it is, House and the Senate and the White House need to submit plans, was we actually, maybe naively so, thought we would have a better chance of getting a Social Security agreement this summer with our partners on the other side of the aisle. We believe that if we put a Social Security plan out there, it would be too tempting for Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi to demagogue it, just like they're doing on Medicare, running all these Medicare campaigns. We figured they would do that on Social Security and make it harder to get a Social Security agreement. So what we wanted to do was make it such that we had a higher likelihood of actually reforming Social Security, because I fundamentally believe if we can reform at least one of our unsustainable entitlement programs, that would help us a lot with the credit markets, with the economy. But unfortunately, we don't seem to have any interest on the other side of the aisle to do any of that. Now, with respect to those safety net programs you talked about, we're simply bringing spending back to where it was just a couple of years ago, growing them more sustainably. Social welfare spending still increases in our budget, but at a more sustainable rate. The safety net is fraying at the edges. And the way in which we choose to reform the safety net is to take a page out of the playbook from the 1990s, the successful welfare reform that President Clinton signed into law. We want to use those elements, those ideas, and apply it to the other welfare programs. That reformed one welfare program. There's still dozens left that were unreformed. And the idea we have behind our safety net reforms is we want to have a safety net that is there to catch people who are slipping through the cracks, to help people when they're down on their luck, and to help people who truly can't help themselves. But we don't want the safety net to be geared toward keeping people on welfare. We want the safety net geared toward getting people back onto their feet onto lives of self-sufficiency. This is why we proposed to consolidate dozens of job training programs into career scholarships to go to workers who are in displaced industries so they can go back to school, get new skills and new trades so they can get back into a career and on their feet. So we're not talking about just green eye shade here. We're talking about saving and transforming the safety net to get people back to work, fulfilling the mission of health and retirement security, saving these programs, paying off our debt, and most importantly, economic growth and job creation. Those are the four things we're seeking to achieve with our budget.
Defense spending. Where are the opportunities to cut defense?
I think Secretary Gates has done a very good job. He's gone through and identified $178 billion in cuts that he believes could occur in the defense. We agree with that, and we accepted those cuts. He recommended taking $100 billion to go to the troops to modernize their weapons and their equipment that are needed, and then $78 billion for deficit reduction. That was what President Obama proposed in his budget, and we agree with that. The other point I want to make, and Republicans are of a mixed opinion on this issue, we believe you have to take some spending cuts to this agency. You can't put $700 billion at a government agency and not expect waste to occur. So we wanted to make sure that we did not dodge taking spending out of DOD to deficit reduction. We do that. But having said all of that, I would love nothing more as a budgeteer to budget for a peace dividend. Here's the problem with that, Maria. We're not at peace. We are at war. And so there's only so far you can go before you actually start compromising the mission and the men and women who are out there valiantly serving our country. And so we don't have the ability to budget for a peace dividend when the world's become a more dangerous place. But having said all of that, we do cut defense. We do take $78 billion out of it for debt reduction, in addition to the $100 billion we take from other parts of the DOD to give to the troops.
I want to get some follow-ups in, as well as some of the questions from the audience. The Bowles-Simpson Fiscal Commission, the administration, and the House Budget Resolution call for reductions in tax expenditures. What are the major tax expenditure items that you would be willing to support, eliminate, or reduce?
On the corporate side, I think you have to look at the entire corporate system. I would transition it toward a territorial system. I would get rid of a lot of the architecture that supports a worldwide tax system in exchange for lowering the tax rates. And basically, I would try and keep expensing. I think that's fairly important. On the individual side, that's where we're going to have to look and see what kind of fiscal room we have and what should stay. I do believe we should means test these at the very least, these kinds of tax expenditures. If you take a look at the top 10 tax expenditures, health care and others, I've always believed in the guise of health care reform, and I've always proposed this in my own health care bills, that the tax exclusion on health care is one of the driving sources of health inflation, that we should take that health benefit and detach it from a person's job and reattach it to the individual, which would change the structure of that tax exclusion. That's probably the biggest tax. I think that is the biggest tax exclusion in tax expenditures. People always ask, well, what about charities and what about mortgage? We're going to have to look at that. What we want to do is do something that's smooth in a transition way, so you're not destabilizing markets just as our economy is trying to recover, just as our economy is trying to get back on its feet. The other thing is we don't have to get rid of all of the tax expenditures like the Fiscal Commission does, because the revenue line we're targeting is lower than the revenue line they were targeting. We're proposing to keep revenues at its historic level. They wanted to bring it to a level that was above what we've ever had before. The basic thing I will conclude with this, if you try to tax your way out of this problem, you'll shut down the economy. The spending line is what is going up so fast. By the time my 3 kids are my age, instead of having government at 20% of GDP, it's at 40% of GDP. So if we try to chase ever higher spending with ever higher taxes, number one, we'll never catch up. And number two, I think we'll shut down our economy and compromise economic growth. Spending is the problem, not taxes. Let's reform the tax code so it works better, so that it actually creates more job and economic growth, so we have more revenues through that. But let's not take our eye off the ball, which is the problem, which is spending. Here's the other thing, Maria. We've put out our plan. We've put out solutions. The other side hasn't. We did not get a budget from the president that fixed this problem. We got a speech a couple days later, or a couple weeks later, that still didn't fix the problem. It doesn't come anywhere close, according to OMB and CBO and everybody else, to actually addressing this entitlement problem. And now it's day 754 since the Senate has not even tried to pass a budget. We have a budget crisis. That's what this whole thing's all about, a fiscal crisis. And the Senate's choosing again this year not to even bother passing a budget. And the White House isn't producing a plan that gets anywhere close to fixing this problem. We put out a plan. We put out a plan using CBO numbers. People may not like the plan, but it fixes the problem. It gets the debt paid off. It balances the budget. It takes time to do it. But it's an actual plan with actual specifics of $6.2 trillion of spending cuts off the president's budget, or $5.8 trillion off the baseline, like you say.
Question from the audience. What are the prospects for a national sales tax or a value-added tax?
Slim to nil, I think. Because the context in which that conversation takes place usually occurs as an additive, in addition to the tax system we have, which would be a very dangerous thing, because I think it would hypergrow government. The other problem is people like myself are not interested in building a new revenue machine to make it easier for government to raise revenue to chase a higher spending line. You got to deal with your spending problems first. I've always believed in consumption-based tax reform. I've authored bills in the past. But what we don't want to do is get the cart in front of the horse. Let's get spending under control. Let's get our spending on the right glide path so our debt is stabilized. And we don't want to end up with a government that is 30 to 40% the size of the economy, because that, to me, will strangle economic growth and job creation. It will give our children an inferior standard of living, and will end the American idea of limited government and free enterprise and a prosperous nation. If we go down that path, the European path of stacking two tax systems on top of each other, I think what will suffer will be economic growth and job creation and the future of our children and grandchildren.
Is the economy too fragile right now to institute such cuts?
I don't believe that. First of all, if you use the economic models that were used to justify all the stimulus spending, suggested that unemployment would never get above 8%. We blew right through that. I don't believe that those economic models and those multipliers, I think they've been pretty thoroughly discredited. I think the best thing we could do is to show that we're getting our spending under control, that we're actually cutting and capping and controlling spending. Of all things, what that would do is help calm the credit markets. It would help show that we're getting this under control, so we're getting inflation under control. It would help protect the dollar, and it would help show signals that we're not going to end up taxing our way out of this problem. Big deficits today are nothing more than more tax increases tomorrow, more interest rate increases tomorrow. And our fiscal policy, I would argue, is on a collision course with our monetary policy. And if we don't get spending under control, which is the cause of these problems, then I think then we will have a problem. So much uncertainty is being injected into the economy, and I personally believe, like Alan Greenspan wrote in a very rigorous regression analysis, government activism, uncertainty on the regulatory state, uncertainty on spending and debts, uncertainty on taxes, and clearly uncertainty on monetary policy are contributing toward an unstable future, an uncertain future. It's putting a chilling effect on economic growth and investment. We believe we should restore the basic foundations of economic growth. Regulations that are clear, transparent, and fair, where we're not picking winners and losers in the marketplace. Spending cuts and controls that get our debt and our borrowing down and stabilized. Tax rates that are low and predictable and stable. And yes, reinstore the idea of sound money so that our currency maintains a reliable store of value, and so that our interest rates are stabilized so investment can be sparked again. Doing things in substitute of those, or doing the opposite of those things, which I would argue we're doing today, that is the problem. Spending and borrowing more money we don't have doesn't grow the economy. I would argue it makes it more volatile.
Alan Greenspan also wrote that higher revenue is required, and he had endorsed higher taxes.
He did. I think higher revenue is clearly helpful, but we should get it through economic growth. We should get higher revenue through job creation and economic growth, and that is why I think fundamental tax reform, and there are plenty of other things I think we should do for economic growth. I just mentioned a few of them. Sound money, regulatory reform, energy, actual domestic energy policy. There are lots of things we should do that we haven't been doing that Congress is gridlocked on to get growth, which gets us more revenues.
The biggest part of the deficit reduction plan is the cuts to Medicare and Medicaid.
I would actually disagree with that. We're growing these programs. These programs continue. First of all, Medicare doesn't have anything for anybody 55 and above, and they don't get cut. They simply grow at a slower rate. If we define spending more money next year, but not as much as we were otherwise planning as a cut, and if that's the conventional wisdom, then we're not going to fix this problem. Then the political paralysis will set in like it has been, and that's going to bring us toward a debt crisis.